This is a special episode where I'm talking with Barry Silverberg, the Director of Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, about the for-profit to nonprofit transition in the second half of life. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 249 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This week, I'm having a different kind of episode. I brought Barry Silverberg, Director of Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, into the Career Pivot community to discuss the for-profit to nonprofit transition. I've known Barry for many years, and I like to say he's the godfather of the nonprofit community in Texas. I have even sought Barry's advice several times during my career. I'm using the audio from that meeting in this episode. We hold these types of meetings every couple of weeks and we record them. In this episode, you will hear Barry and I discuss the transition, and then he takes questions from my membership. Because of this podcast, I'm able to get people to come speak and offer their knowledge and advice to the Career Pivot community. As I've said before, this podcast is my greatest networking tool I've ever had. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community, which this episode is all about, continues to help the members who are participating in this project grow and thrive. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out, figure out what they want to do in the second half of life, and then make it happen. I would normally insert a testimonial at this point, but I think this episode is a testament to the kinds of things we do within the community. I am recruiting new members for the next cohort. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. I will be discussing several pivots I made into the nonprofit side and what I learned from those experiences after the interview. So hang around for that topic. Barry also mentions a number of websites and documents in the session. All links and documents can be accessed at the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-249. Now, on to my discussion with Barry Silverberg. Welcome to our Wednesday night community call and the Repurpose Your Career podcast. Tonight, we have the real joy of having Barry Silverberg, who is the director of the Austin Community College Center for Nonprofit Excellence?
It's nonprofit studies.
Nonprofit studies.
Yeah, we try to avoid excellence.
Okay. And Barry, why don't you introduce yourself so people know who you are?
Okay. So as Mark just said, I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, which is a rather large institution. What we do is offer workforce development. We call them learning opportunities. We avoid things like training, even the word teaching, because it's all really about learning for adults. We offer certificates in a variety of the key competencies required to be an effective and competent nonprofit professional or practitioner. And we basically serve as an information and resource center for people either interested in careers in the nonprofit sector, including folks who want to, after having had a career, want to come into the nonprofit sector. So one of the things we do is we try to offer people resources and offer them some guidance about where to find information. There's lots of information out there. So I've been in the arena for about 46 years right now. I created this center back 22 years ago.
And for people who don't know, Austin Community College is a small little university of 50,000 students.
Yep.
It's, I don't know, 17 campuses. It's a quite a large institution.
Yes.
Including myself in my 50s, I decided to go into the nonprofit world. If you were going to advise someone who says, I'm at the end of my for-profit career, what should be the first steps I should do to say, okay, how do I go about do this?
If it were me, okay, my first step would be to test my assumption of whatever I assume the experience of working for a nonprofit might be. So if I've had experience with nonprofits, then I would have a sense of what it's like to be a volunteer. But I can tell you, being paid and with the expectations that come with that in terms of performance, knowledge, etc., it's a different world. So the first thing is check your assumptions. And I would sit down and I would literally lay out what are my assumptions. Another question along those lines is, are you looking at the nonprofit sector because you're attracted to it? Or you're looking at it because you're repelled from whatever you may have been doing or your perceptions of the for-profit sector, okay, or government or whatever else, okay? So, if you're coming with the bounce effect, it ain't going to work very well. Why, being clear about what your rationale and what your reasons really are. Then I would consider what I would call strategic volunteering. And by strategic volunteering, I mean that I would identify what I'm really interested in doing. What are the issues? Sometimes it's an issue that attracts people, like children, or sex trafficking, or some other societal ill, or maybe it's to promote culture. I mean, we're not just fighting bad stuff. We're also trying to promote good stuff in terms of culture and so forth. So the nonprofit sector is highly complex, much more complex than most people realize. So once I have an idea, perhaps of where I want to be lending my skills and et cetera, I think the next thing would be what I call strategic volunteering, is see if that organization can use some of your skills as a volunteer. That's something to look at. Another thing would be basically strategic interviewing. So what I always recommend is if you come to me and say, I'm looking for a job, then right away you're in a box. I don't have a job. I don't want to have a conversation because either I'm sensitive, I don't want to hurt your feelings, or I'm too busy and you're the 80 millionth person who came to me. I suggest that you frame yourself and ask people for their insights and perspectives on how you can apply your skills, your interests, your competencies to achieve whatever it is you want to achieve. Again, I've lived my entire life in the nonprofit sector. So I've worked obviously with a lot of other folks, but some of what I'm saying may sound sort of soft to people who've been in the rough and tumble of the corporate world. And that doesn't mean there aren't rough and tumble spots in the nonprofit sector. But for the most part, folks in the nonprofit sector live with a myth that they're caring, they're doing good, etc. Whether they are or not, it's another issue. But they have that myth. And I think that one has to play to that myth, which is often reality. Okay. The other thing I'd say, and I can go on, but for the moment, is become informed about what it is, what's the substance of the nonprofit sector. So one of the things I want to put on the screen, which I'll send to Mark and he could share with y'all, and I'm just using, is this on, Mark?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. So I'm just showing you the second page, which deals with the United States. The first page deals with Texas. Basically, let me look at this and go through it really quick, because I think that'll answer a lot of your questions. Mark, and just stop me if you want to stop me, okay? As I tell everybody, I'm married for 46 years, so I'm not used to talking as long as I've just talked. So feel free to interrupt. It'd make me very comfortable. If you're interested in how nonprofits govern themselves, BoardSource has enormous amounts of information. A lot of free stuff. So depending upon your economic circumstances, you don't need to go to a bookstore and buy a bunch of books. As a matter of fact, I urge people to really go with the literature as opposed to buying these books that some hotshot has just basically compiled and puts a price on. There's a lot more to be found in a lot of free places. In terms of your transition, or what are sometimes called bridgers, when you move from one sector to another, or a term I heard yesterday, sector switches, that kind of struck me as kind of weird. But BridgeSpan is an enormously good resource. It talks about things that people that are bridging should keep in mind. Much of what I'm going to share with you, based on whatever questions come out, is going to come from BridgeSource in addition to my own experience. I would definitely suggest everybody go up to BridgeSpan and check it out under the word bridgers. If you're interested in specifics about nonprofit practice, then this free management library is filled with resources. Any subject you can imagine with nonprofits, they've got articles. I'm going to go a little quicker down here. If you're looking for sort of coursework, free coursework to identify some of the competencies and to become proficient in them, the nonprofitready.org provides fantastic resources free of charge. What they do is take resources available in the corporate world and the nonprofit world, buy them, and then make them available free of charge. The other things down here are basically going to be about more information that's more substantive about the domain of nonprofits. I think it's important you become aware of some of the lingo we use, the language we use, and we can talk about some of the things not to do separately, showing that you've made an effort to understand the sector. Because in my experience, a goodly number of people who make a transition often enter into the arena with a sense of condescension and patronization. And because of their experience in the business world, they think for some reason the nonprofit world, that'll be easy. Actually, in some ways, it's much more difficult because the authority structures. Again, we can talk about it based on the questions. But the last thing I want to point up here is at the bottom, get yourself a copy of the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Go up to their website, which they have some free stuff up there. See what the issues are. See what we're dealing with in the sector. The Harvard Business Review has some fantastic articles on philanthropy and nonprofits. And then the other things you see here, the Chronicle, you can get up there and see that stuff free. Getting familiar with resources, I think, is really important.
I will also post a link to this for the podcast listeners in the show notes of the podcast. So, Barry, what's the biggest mistakes that people make?
Wanting to be in the sector. No. Beyond that, I think the biggest mistakes is to enter into the arena with a sense that you have something really significant to offer, and the rest of us are a bunch of dummies waiting for your revelation. I'm from New York. You can tell by my sarcasm, but that really is so irritating, and it's not the way to make friends. So one thing, to not do is to come in like you're the savior. Number two is to be really aware, as much as you can, of the differential in the amount of assets and resources available to you. So if you're used to, some technology, it may or may not be available to you, not because the nonprofit is necessarily poor, because they're just unsophisticated in certain arenas. At the same time, you may find some areas where nonprofits are much more sophisticated. So I think just coming in with humility, I think that's critical. Knowing the lingo and really listening. I've always found it's amazing when you ask a question and you listen how much you learn. And again, you can read all the books about nonprofits, get all the lingo, but the bottom line is, are you ready to, it's not all slings and arrows, but are you ready to subsume your ego? Because a major part, often, not always, of nonprofit practice is subsuming your own ego in order to accomplish something, playing the role of the facilitator, of the intermediary, as opposed to the doer, particularly when you're working with volunteers. And some of you may be volunteers and you may have had that experience. It's primarily if one wants to effectively accomplish something, then one has to take on different roles. And I assume it's similar in a corporate setting. And the good news, there's always somebody else you can kick in the process. So, there's always somebody below you.
How important is you pursue an organization based on its cause?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Well, a lot of times, I know I did when I first said, I'm going to try and go do the nonprofit. And finding a nonprofit I said, I got hired by the Jewish Community Center of Austin. I'm not Jewish.
I was the head of it 20 years ago. I would never have hired you.
And the fact was, one of the challenges is most of these organizations are cause-based organizations, right?
Right.
And I didn't align with the cause. I was just looking to get some experience. How important is it to find, to really pursue an organization based on the cause?
Yeah. I think it goes back to what I said in the beginning. It goes back to why you're entering into the arena. Okay. And so a little later, if we have time, I'll show you a little schemata I use, and I'll make it available to everybody as well. In terms of identifying what you like, what you're good at, finding the sweet spot, figuring out why, identifying your competencies, etc. Okay. Standard, outsourcing, career coaching, etc. Except with the difference that humanity, the personhood of a person, if I can use that term, is important. While corporate types who come to see me, and I do a lot of this, and when they come to see me, they get a little uncomfortable, and I say, well, what are your interests? What are your volunteer activities? What makes you into a human being? What communicates your essence, not just your competencies? And so that becomes really, really important. So if you're really gung-ho and passionate about serving children, then you're going to look for that. If you're gung-ho about helping people in general, there's a lot of opportunities. If you're gung-ho about improving financial operations, then it may not matter as much about what you're doing. So, Mark, whatever you did at the Jewish Community Center, okay, you not being Jewish really is totally irrelevant. If you were in charge of Jewish cultural programming, okay, then I'd be very concerned, okay, obviously, because you probably know very little about it. So, but if you're there dealing with leadership development in general, or if you're there helping people find jobs in general, well, there's nothing specifically Jewish about it. Just like there's nothing specific childrenish about being a good manager or whatever. So for myself, despite the fact my 25 years of my life, I actually spent leading Jewish federations. My passion now is really on upgrading the skill sets of people in the sector. If you have a similar kind of passion, a desire to teach, or desire to help people to learn, there's a place. So it comes down to a lot of introspection.
We have a question here. Someone who's done both paid and free nonprofit studies. She's been a board member of a membership committee focused on traveling, My question is, what's the best entry point as a volunteer? Fundraising, event delivery, or something else?
Depends on your skill set. Basically, the myth around fundraising is it's about money. And actually, fundraising has almost nothing to do with money. It has to do with relationship building. And so as one explores the sector in terms of all the ones that are mentioned, okay, that was just mentioned, it really is where your strengths are. The challenge with fundraising, it's extremely measurable. And people who enter into it usually are a little more competitive because it's measurable and you can see your success, et cetera. Not always. By the way, I'm more than glad if anybody wants to reach out to me to have a conversation beyond this, if you'd like. It really depends where you want to enter into, what your skill levels are. And what I would do is, depending upon who you are and what your skill levels are, I believe in going to the top. So if I was interested in fundraising, I would call it the development director, which may have a whole variety of titles, and say, hey, I'd like to sit down and talk to you about how I might become engaged with your organization. And if you can offer me guidance on other potential things. Networking is at least in Austin, particularly, is absolutely essential. You got to let people know you're out there and you're interested.
For me, one of the things I've found in helping people is understanding nonprofit finances. And can you comment on the importance of, just simply because nonprofit finances is real different than the for-profit side?
Since I don't understand the for-profit side, and never, by the way, make the joke that you're entering the nonprofit sector because you can't make a profit. If you think about that, it's kind of insulting. So that, those are the kinds of sensitivities, that people may not think about.
Right.
Basically, the defining characteristic, when we talk about nonprofits, we're actually talking about 28 different kinds of entities. So most people, when they talk about nonprofits, are talking about what are called charitable nonprofits, where they get a tax deduction. Okay. There's also associations and other kinds of groups, political groups, et cetera. There's a whole variety, and you might want to explore that. Nonprofit financial management is focused on recycling any surplus revenue. Okay. The new language we use is profit, actually, but the profit does not go to stakeholders. It goes back in the organization. So that's a difference. The current financial statements that are being used will show some equity, will show profit at the bottom. The other difference that underlines it is there is no equity in nonprofit sector. And I'm not talking about social equity. I'm talking about financial equity. There is no ownership. The ownership is replaced with the concept of control. And the concept of control is by the board of directors. And the staff, led by the director or the manager, president, CEO, whatever their title is, actually is the only employee usually hired by the board, and then he or she hires everybody else. So there's no ownership. When a nonprofit dissolves, a 501c3 dissolves, any assets need to go to another 501c3. It doesn't get split up amongst the partners. Okay. We don't have stockholders. What we have is what we call stakeholders. And it's a very different concept of stockholders. So because of that difference, we're not looking to assess the fair distribution of revenue in the same way that you would if you were running a business.
Yeah, one of the things I've gotten a lot of experience at is learning how to read 990s and looking at organizations and looking at where are they getting their money, who's getting paid. I've always gotten used to going to guidestar.org and then be able to assess, like, do these people have any money? Where are they getting their money? One of the things I've found that's been valuable is just some understanding what are the revenue sources. In the for-profit side, it's largely by selling stuff. There are all kinds of ways that nonprofits raise money.
The mythology is most of nonprofit money comes from grants or contributions. The reality is something like 80% come from earned revenue. Earned revenue is either government contracts, other contracts, and basically earned revenue is you've done something to earn your revenue. Okay? So you provide a service. So that's where the vast majority of nonprofit money comes from, which is always news to even people in the nonprofit sector, because a good deal of focus is on grant writing and all this sort of stuff. That's not where the real money is, except for some organizations, depending on what you're doing. Your sources of revenue depend upon what you're doing. A lot of nonprofits receive a lot of government funds if they're providing social services. Corporations will give money to nonprofits to promote, to fund something. The danger for the nonprofit is to believe that the corporation is doing it for the good of mankind or womankind or peoplekind. In actuality, and it's very reasonable, they're doing it for their own image making and other reasons. There may be altruistic motives, but regardless. And so the marketing, the transaction, the nonprofit person has to be sophisticated to understand the motivations and the needs of the other party, which leads me to say one other thing, that when one is making a transition, such as some of you may be thinking about, you need to assess what your own competencies are, and then to see which of those competencies are transferable to the nonprofit sector and the difference in language. And I myself find a tool, which I'm sure Mark knows very well, and some of you may know, very, very helpful. And that's the Korn Ferry Leadership Architect tool. Just their one 11 by 17 page, which lists about 28 or 30 competencies, really is very helpful to go down and say, I can do that. That's what I do. And for me, I always recommend to people I help with their resumes and career kind of stuff, is you will find perhaps that you have competencies that you've called something else or that you don't realize you have. And the last thing I'd say there is that as far as your involvement in the nonprofit sector, your competencies are not just what you've learned at work. Your ability to persevere, your ability to deal with the kinds of hassles or whatever of life are all absolutely critical. Now, I know they're also critical in the for-profit sector. So I suspect somebody out there might be saying, hey, Barry, if you're going to transition into the for-profit sector, where there's no chance of, but if I were, don't be condescending towards us. So I can see that possibility. But the point here is that I find that as long as you're earnest, you're passionate about something, you're open to listening, you've got some stuff going for you in terms of skills, you could find a place in the nonprofit sector. And there are a lot of jobs. It all depends on what you're looking for.
So what kinds of certifications do you offer at ACC?
In the nonprofit sector, there are very few certifications. A certification is a national entity who's come up with a national standard, and they attest to the fact you've met their standard. Usually includes experience and knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. We offer certificates, and which basically means that you've completed a course of study. And if you go to our website, I put on the chat our website, NonProfit Austin. And if you go to our website, you'll see the certificates, which are in the key competencies, which are nonprofit leadership and management, volunteer engagement, grant writing, effective fundraising, and nonprofit financial management. And we're about to unveil one in nonprofit advocacy, talent management, human resources, and one in strategic communications. So what I like to tell people when I do these kinds of talks or conversations is no matter what your skill sets are, you will find a place to use them. Let me just point out two other things that I put in the chat. I put in our website. I also put in a particular document, which is called Principles and Practices, and you can download it. It's all free. And you might be able to might get a better idea how nonprofits operate. So if you're a management person or an operations person, you're going to see the crazy way we operate, at least the principles we operate under. And then I've given you something which is not out there in the public, which is a library that can show you books and articles about nonprofit. You can't access them there, but you can see a lot of good stuff. That's part of one of our new initiatives. So that might be helpful to some of you as well.
The question came in, do you feel a master's in nonprofit worth the expense?
It depends upon where you are in your own career. Let me just say this. Nobody asked, but a doctorate is a waste of money, except if you have that aspiration to have a doctorate, which is certainly fine. I've always had that aspiration and had to give it up for a lot of reasons. But what you want to do more than anything else is to show that you have engaged in ongoing learning, that you take the sector seriously, and that you've tried to gain a domain of knowledge. The assumption is that a master's degree encapsulates all that. And in some places, the credential is going to be important. There is also something called a certified nonprofit professional, which we just got engaged in. Actually, just last week, we signed up with them as a center. You can look up at a place called Nonprofit Leadership Alliance, and look up Nonprofit Leadership Alliance, and you'll see that they have a workforce track. You learn some things, you meet as part of a cohort over a period of time, and then you get this credential. The credential being that you've passed a test. And I would say that it probably is a worthwhile experience. The cost is about $300, I think, at most. So it's, it all depends on where you're at economically, but it's not that much money in the bigger scheme of things. Our certificates are available when we've moved everything online. So we expect to be doing that for another year. And even then, we will probably continue online programming, because for us, it's been a tremendous explosion in terms of services. So, and also, the master's degree, what I always try to do is say, well, that encapsulates something. What does it encapsulate? It encapsulates a presumption of expertise, okay? And you got to balance. Can you get that expertise elsewhere? All right. So if you're a financial manager and you understand, financial management, and or performance of management or human resources, okay, not everything has a special, nonprofit hook. Well, financial management does. then I would say just go out there, try to understand what that element is, and look for a position without that. If you're trying to get into programming, if you want to do counseling, the experience is going to be important. The nonprofit sector overall hasn't reached a point where, quote, professional credentials are essential. Okay. And you need to look at what we're doing and where you want to get involved. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
How does compensation in nonprofit compare to the government and for-profit and other sectors?
It depends on what job you have. Okay. I think it really depends on what job you have. I think that if you're a corporate type and you've been doing really well in the corporate arena, you can expect a cut. Okay. It depends upon what that, again, it all depends where you're at. There is something, there's a compensation study there's two major compensation studies that are done. One is by, it's skipping me. You mentioned it before, where you get your 990.
GuideStar?
GuideStar, thank you. Which is now called Candid. That's one place. And another place is put out by the Nonprofit Times. So I would offer to your listeners, if anybody has a particular job they want to know, email me and I'd be glad to give you the page, because they sell the damn thing for $500. And you don't want to pay $500 just to find out you're going to earn $25,000. But I would just say that, and this was the focus of my remarks the last time I spoke with Mark, which was 5 years ago, is you're not taking a vow of poverty. I live in a damn nice house, put my kids through college, live a damn good life. You're not taking a vow of poverty. But again, it depends upon your motivation. You might be in a position where you're just trying to do good. That's fine. And I've learned that for a lot of people who've lived their lives in the for-profit sector, that their remuneration, whether they need it or not, is a measure of their ego and their self-satisfaction and whether they're a success or not. I've worked with people who have demanded payment for a class and then would just donate it right back to me, which is kind of stupid because they just added to their income and they're paying more than the donation is worth. That's their value system. Again, I'm more than glad to give people specific information. If you're running a major agency with more than 100 employees, I think you can expect a salary in the mid 100,000s. Okay, which depending on what you're doing may or may not be a major salary or not.
So Mike asks, generally, do people start out in nonprofits or do they transition from the for-profit world?
It's a process of steady decline. No, just joking. The interesting thing about the nonprofit sector is that you get a lot of people who either because they have the financial wherewithal, which they don't have to work and do certain things, or because they're just really into whatever the cause might be and are willing to forsake revenue to be able to do their passion. Or people like yourselves, perhaps, who have reached a point and now you're tired of doing what you're doing, or for whatever reasons, you want to do something else. Okay. At this point, I would say probably the majority of people operating the nonprofit sector today have not gone through a comprehensive education in the sector. What we offer is sort of an intermediary approach. We deal with the key competencies required to be effective, competent, ethical. We got all kinds of nice words we attach to that. Competent practitioner. We don't deal with academics, with academic elements. So it's very, very focused. So if you're looking at a master's degree, I would urge you to look for a master's degree that was very, very practical and so forth. There are a lot of continuing education programs that have those kinds of, not master's degrees, but some kind of credentialing process. Ours is very, very comprehensive. I think that, again, it goes back to what you want to do and what you feel. I mean, I come across a lot of people who say they're gurus. And as far as I'm concerned, they don't know anything. It really depends on what your personality is, what you need, okay, to feel competent and to be competent.
And I'm going to paraphrase John's question is, where's the demand for people in the nonprofit sector?
The sector goes through cycles. Right now, we're in a social equity DEI cycle. And I'm not making comments about the importance of these issues, okay? Back in the 70s, everybody was concerned about the elderly, okay? And now that I've reached there, nobody gives a damn. Okay. So, and I don't take it personally. Okay. But I think what's most needed are people with strategic perspectives. So I'm dealing with skill sets, competencies, as opposed to somebody who's particularly interested in kids or teenagers, et cetera. I think what we need most in our sector right now are people who are strategic, who can look and help people to do things better, more effectively. We're not about efficiency. Efficiency is getting a thing done with the least resources. Having a board of directors of 10 or 12 or 15 people is extremely inefficient, but very effective given the mission of a nonprofit. So leadership skills, I think if you have management skills that are translatable, fundraisers are always hired, if you have those skills, but they don't exactly translate into salesmanship. It's not exactly the same kind of thing. What I like to do is whoever I'm talking with is find out what they want to do and go through an exercise, which may or may not sound silly, but you identify your competencies and then imaginably throw them up in the air, watch them float around and watch them land. And what do you see? And the example I give you is that a social worker and a funeral director, when you think about the competencies required to do their jobs, are very, very similar. And it might not be obvious to people. So looking at what you've done, identifying that, finding the cross references, the transference, you may find your interests are much different than you may think they are.
And John comes back and says, are there neglected areas in the sector?
Okay. So John, number one, you have the right skill set. You're persistent. Okay. That's important. I say that jokingly, but that's really important that, to stay focused on something. So I think the areas that the ones that are neglected are the ones that are paying the least amount of money. And therefore the people involved there are primarily there because of their passion. Working with poverty, unless you're working for a big agency, which makes more money off poverty than whatever. It is working in those areas where the sector is not paying, and therefore it's not able to attract real qualified talent. And one of the challenges we still have is that people are passionate, but competency and discipline don't always accompany the passion. And that's what we're all about. And that's what a lot of my colleagues are all about, is really trying to instill more of a focus on competency and skill sets with the belief that most people can acquire those if they have the right mindset. But passion isn't enough. Passion is what I would call white glove charity. It's noblesse oblige. It's coming and helping those poor savages who need your help, as opposed to being in the arena with them and understanding how people evolve and how you affect change. And changing people is very different than changing organizations.
What has the pandemic done to the nonprofit sector? I know there have been, as we've seen, there's the great retirement. And I know in Central Texas, the leadership for many years, people were concerned about it because it was getting very gray.
Well, in my agency, we've moved beyond gray to no hair. Okay. So the impact on the nonprofit sector has been the same to some extent as on the for-profit sector in terms of the great resignation that people talk about. And that's happening, interesting enough, mostly among millennials and younger folks, okay, who are challenging themselves for a lot of reasons in the workplace. There's some of that. And then we go to the fact that those that are left, the salaries are often lower, particularly in areas that are needed, okay? I don't see, and I'm not aware of any significant executive resigning because of COVID. What I'm aware of, the difficulty of getting people, both volunteers and staff, for a place like Meals on Wheels to deliver stuff in terms of people who need to interact with other people. So there's a fear among some people, despite the political environment in Texas, which is against masks. There's those kinds of elements. The latest study, which just came out just the other day, actually, shows that the sector has rebounded, and about 70% of the jobs that were lost have been refilled at this point. So, there's some of that that's going on as well. In some ways, the nonprofit sector is no different than the for-profit sector. I would say in Austin in particular, up until COVID, the actual growth in the nonprofit sector job-wise was greater than the for-profit sector. And that's with all of the technology and our new superhero, Elon Musk.
So, Mandy, rephrase your question. Business operations, where does that role fit in a nonprofit? Reality, how many nonprofits have a budget for business operations?
Okay. If I understand the term, we're not talking about business development. We're talking about business operations. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. So in our terms, at least in my limited knowledge, it's management. Okay. Management is going to be as sophisticated as the size of the organization. The vast majority of nonprofits are small. Okay. Like 80% have gross revenue under $500,000. Okay. There aren't that many that are up there in the 10 million and so categories. So depending upon, I know my wife's experience, she came from, she actually worked in a hospital system, which purported to be a nonprofit. But the bottom line here is that, she had a budget way over $10 million. Just her little operation was bigger than some of the biggest nonprofits in Austin. Okay. The larger operations are going to have sophisticated operations. So a place like Upswing, which used to be Lutheran Social Services, which provides a whole variety of services, which is probably more than $100 million operation, is going to have, an operation as sophisticated as probably any other business of $100 million. Nonprofits are not businesses in the sense that we're moving or motivated by generating a surplus or what would be called a profit. Okay. However, what's really critical to know and understand is that in order to provide the services we provide, you need to run a cost-effective, perhaps even cost-efficient operation. And you need to make sure you have all the same business practices in place that the law requires. Nonprofits are basically, almost all, not everyone, is a corporation. And by the way they're formed, and they have to follow, Sarbanes-Oxley and everything else. So the smaller the organization, the less sophisticated it is, but it still has the same obligations. If you have business operation expertise, I'd be looking at organizations that, if you're in a town that has a business journal, for example, Austin Business Journal publishes annually a list of nonprofits, that the top 100, if they're on that list, they're probably going to be pretty sophisticated. But you're talking, I would look at the revenue that they bring in. Actually, I'd look at their revenue and their expenses, because revenue could be misleading if somebody has a large grant. So revenue doesn't necessarily reflect success in the terms of an efficient business operation.
How many nonprofits are looking for folks with experience in lead generation?
Okay, lead generation. I've never heard that.
Yeah, I kind of figured you didn't. That is finding new customers or finding people who want your service.
I'm sorry, lead generation.
Yeah.
I thought lead generation was like equivalent to millennials. Okay, so I understand lead generation. Primary place where that skill set is used is in fundraising, in resource development. The ability to do prospecting, which is basically what lead generation is, as I understand it, and using the available databases about people's wealth and people's interests and understanding the social media, et cetera, and data mining and all that sort of stuff, which may be not the same, but in the same bucket, is for a large organization is essential. So you may not think of them as nonprofits, but universities, religious institutions, particularly mega churches, which are large operations. Associations is another arena. So there isn't just the charitable organizations. And if you're looking, again, I'm familiar with Texas, but if you're looking for positions in the association world, your state probably has an association of association executives. In Texas, it's called the Texas Society of Association Executives. So if you take your state, put SAE.org, it may work. And that's a place to find a lot of information. And you might find the transition or the nature of the job more akin to how they're defined in what I'm saying, the corporate world, or again, my world is bipolar. It's for-profit or nonprofit. And I realize it's very complex on both sides. So, but I think that would be a place to look. And again, I would just say that I am available to give resources. There's lots of free stuff available in the nonprofit sector. My whole operation revels in giving things away for free and sticking it to those who are trying to make money on stuff that is available for free. So I guess that makes us democratic with a small d.
Well, Barry, this has been great. If someone wanted to reach out and contact you, how might they do that?
Take my name, reversed, silverberg.barry@gmail.com. That's a place to reach me. If you're interested in the resources and I have a private practice, that would, that's where you'd meet me as a person, as opposed to the center as, whatever I'm talking, whatever persona I'm talking in. And the website for the nonprofit Austin is on the web, is the first thing I put down there. And I'd encourage you to go up there and look around. One thing that you might find helpful is there's a webinar up there that I did several years ago on starting a nonprofit. Now, you may not be interested in starting a nonprofit, but the first 45 minutes of it are fundamentals about nonprofits. And you might find that of interest.
Well, Barry, thank you very much for meeting with us and being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Hope you enjoyed that conversation. Barry has a wealth of knowledge and loves to share it freely. Now, let me tell you about my forays into the nonprofit world. First, let me give you some background. I got into bicycling in the very late 1990s. I became involved with the Austin Cycling Association, an all-volunteer membership organization that promoted cycling and cycling safety for all ages. In about 2005, 2006, I became head of education, where I was responsible for running bicycle rodeos for children and distributing bicycle helmets, which we did. We gave away thousands of helmets every year. This was really my full extent of my nonprofit experience up to that point. After my bicycle accident in 2002, I left the tech world to teach high school math at an inner city high school. This has been well documented in the blog, so I will not get into the detail. When I left teaching in early 2006, I was really lost. And I made the decision to pursue the nonprofit world, and I took a three-pronged approach. First was to pursue turning Austin Cycling Association into a professional organization. We had a few part-time contractors, but what we really needed was a full-time executive director. We had a significant amount of money in the bank, like tens of thousands of dollars, but we struggled growing our mission as an all-volunteer organization. I also saw that we were going to have problems with volunteer burnout because we had a lot of volunteers and they really worked and we didn't really know how to do stuff. I like to say Austin Cycling Association at that point was what I refer to at the adolescence phase. We had grown large enough as a nonprofit, as an all-volunteer nonprofit, that we either had to shrink or grow. We couldn't stay there. I like to say we were kind of like a teenager, where not everything works the way you think it's supposed to work. And I've been involved with several organizations since then where it's really hard to shift. And after meeting with several leaders of cycling associations that had significantly larger budgets, i.e. in the millions of dollars, I saw the significant challenges of moving an all-volunteer organization to one with paid staff. That was a challenge I was not equipped to do. The organization eventually experienced volunteer burnout, as I had predicted, and later was merged with several other struggling cycling groups in what I refer to as a shotgun marriage. The second approach was to do what Barry suggested. I had informational interviews with every educational nonprofit in Central Texas. I quickly concluded that it would take way too long to make inroads into these organizations. I did find a couple of organizations I really liked and were functional, but I didn't have the time to make that happen. The last approach was to look for a fundraising position in any organization that would take me. And I landed at the JCAA, or the Jewish Community Association of Austin, and I was hired to develop a corporate development program. They specifically hired me because I had business contacts within the community, and I had been a JCAA member. I actually worked out there. I used the gym. I like to say being a non-Jew as the face of a Jewish organization is interesting. I realized at about 6 months I would not be successful, as the several people who had preceded me in the position had not been successful either. I'm not going to get into why. I left after working for about a year, and I made the transition nice and smooth. I learned a lot. One thing I learned is I cannot work for a nonprofit as a paid staff member. I saw so much dysfunctional behavior and slow decision-making in all the organizations I'd been associated with that I can't tolerate that stuff. I learned a lot about nonprofit finances, which helped me a lot in working on nonprofit boards, and I've served on a variety of boards, including Austin Car Share, the first car sharing organization in Texas, Austin Cycling Association, Metropolitan Breakfast Club, and Launchpad Job Club. I can serve as a board member, but my temperament is not suited to work as a paid staff member of a nonprofit, which, by the way, I'm comfortable with. That's my story, and that hopefully makes a little more sense of some of my comments during the interview. So take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While there, check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You will also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-249. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.